Okay, I got it in quick enough, but you know, I'm too lazy to cut anything together. That's why I stream this thing direct. As usual, we're going to give YouTube Live a little bit of time. It's a massive amount of noise back there. But as usual, we're going to give YouTube a little bit of time to catch up. And then I'm going to start my little review of Heavy Rain. Just recently played through it. The videos are still going up at the moment. I get 8 of them in total. So clearly got a lot of content out of it, which usually isn't it's not the greatest sign for a game. But I got my nerd glasses on. We're gonna roll through and talk about things. It's gonna be basically the same format as I usually do in the past couple of reviews I've done here. Gonna go graphics, gameplay, story. That's just how I choose to break them up. That's how I like to talk about them. Those are sort of the 3 things that stand out the most to me, and I like to talk a little bit more about the minutia of each of those parts, which I don't necessarily think. I think a lot of times, especially graphics, just gets that sort of, and then everybody kind of lets it go. But that's fine. We're going to talk about all of those things this time around, and just like per the usual. So, since I'm fairly certain that YouTube is caught up and it's actually going to make this video properly, because I like to live stream them, but I don't like to edit them, we'll get started here. Let's start off with graphics. Heavy Rain was one of those things that was sort of a PS3 graphical showcase. I don't remember if you guys remember the tech demo. It's all over the place. If you just search Heavy Rain tech demo or Quantic Dream tech demo or probably even PS3 tech demo, it's one of the first ones to come up. It's basically the chick who played Lauren doing a weird, overwrought, semi-dramatic scene where she points a gun around. And at the time, it was very, very nice looking, and honestly, it's actually a little better than I think the overall game ended up looking, but it was a pretty decent benchmark, and Heavy Rain aimed for that. So that's sort of the backstory of the graphics. Moving into it, I'd say the overall is that the game generally looks pretty all right. For a PS3 game, certainly the faces are some of the best looking, and they like to remind you of that by constantly giving you close-ups of people's faces. It was one of the earlier games to do some nice rain shaders, which is kind of important because it's the title of the game. But I gotta say, my general sort of okayness with the graphics is one of those things that gets me into the sort of game that it is. And in this sort of game, the graphics have to be nothing less than perfect. It's a sort of game that leans very heavily on both story and atmosphere, and in that sort of a situation, I gotta say, pretty all right doesn't necessarily cut it. Or rather than being pretty all right, the graphics need to be cohesive. Everything in the game needs to be of a certain style. So let's run through. The first sort of problem that you run into in general in Heavy Rain is that the game itself suffers from what I like to call the face at all costs school of graphical decision making. This is something that you've seen on consoles for a long time, where basically they put the bulk of the processing power into the face and facial animation, texturing, and shading for sake of character emotion, which they think is far and away the most important thing. The earliest example I can remember of this is way, way back at E3, like 2,000 million years ago, where they first showed off the Final Fantasy X tech demo. They were like, we have over 3,000 polygons in the face. It was probably more like 10,000 polygons in the face or something like that. Look how round the faces are. They can approximate human emotion, and that's great. But I mean, the thing was, when you, especially even now when you go look back at it, yes, the faces are very round and very detailed, but they're very static and kind of bad. And everybody remembers this sort of Titus laughing like a seagull scene as the standout of that whole thing. That's bad dubbing to be blamed there more than anything else, but it's certainly a part of the baseline problem of these games. They throw everything into the face and leave everything else behind, assuming that, hey, humans react to and understand emotion through the face. This is a failed assumption, I'd say, overall, because largely emotion is sort of a symbolic thing. And while fantastic facial animation modeling is great and can go a long way, you need to understand that emotion is conveyed in a number of ways, including body language, if you're going to be going down this road. Beyond that, we understand emotion symbolically, while the emotions in a game that is far more simple, let's say, what was that game? Grim Fandango. There we go. Finally, I nailed it. Take Grim Fandango as a perfect example. Emotion in that game is all over the place. There's happy, sad. There are moments of genuine emotion throughout the game, and they are literally texture swaps on the face of a very rudimentary 3D model. We understand emotion as we see it. We don't necessarily need the subtlety of it, and the closer you try to get to the subtlety of a given facial emotion by way of animation, the more you're likely to fail at it, because the better you do, the more our brains try to pick up what we recognize as a human face, which means that we recognize the things that are wrong. This is how we tell the difference between a person who's sad and a person who's possibly going to pose us a threat because they're in an unstable but also negative emotion kind of state. And that's why we're so good at it, because obviously from a danger point of view, I need to know if somebody's sad or if somebody's, making a sad face because they're having a psychological breakdown. There are lots of minor signifiers in there that certainly a PS3 game is not going to be able to get across. Beyond that, again, body language can be very cartoon, but still get across the nature of the emotion that they're trying to represent. In games like this, they dump everything into the face. You end up sometimes with wonky hand animations. This was very true of a couple of times with Norman Jaden, where he'd look down at his hand, and I assume they were very, very proud of their hand animation, but it just didn't come off in the right way. The focus of face first and character second, it ends up, especially once you get beyond body language and things like that, because obviously character animation is one of those things you're going to be concerned about, and largely weirdly sort of detail oriented, like moving coats and moving ties that react to the way the character moves around the room. These are largely set pieces that we're less likely to notice, hilariously enough. What happens, though, is that you end up leaving environments fairly severely wanting in a lot of places. In Heavy Rain especially, there are regular zooms onto low-quality textures and models, especially bad on windows, which have water that's supposed to be on them, or the reflections in windows being non-existent. While mirrors work, the windows don't reflect anything and have very strongly pixelated things on them. Set props, and what in any other game would be perfectly reasonable filler textures in an action game as you move through a room, it doesn't need to be as richly detailed, and the textures don't matter quite so much. What does it say on that box of donuts on the shelf in the weird marketplace that Scott Shelby goes to somewhere in the middle of the game so that he can get some more clues about who he's going to kill later on? Spoilers, by the way. There will be spoilers. I forgot to say it earlier. I should have read the description, kids. But that's sort of the takeaway, right? When I'm walking through a little convenience store and it seems sort of obvious that everything is just a replicated prop over and over, or if it looks like it's just a series of actually just rectangles that have had cheap textures slapped onto them, or the entire back wall is essentially one giant model to save on polygons, it's obvious. And that's a problem in a game like this, because this is a game where I'm immersed not because of the gameplay. In fact, I'm not immersed in the gameplay. I'm immersed in the environment. When I'm immersed in the environment, I need to be able to look around at things and say, these are real. I feel like I could pick them up and do things with them. And even if I'm not able to, I need to be able to make sure that the camera is at no point sort of pointed at something that's under modeled or under textured. In this case, obviously, they were working within the constraints of the PS3. But I think if they had done an overall sort of system where everything was paid sort of the same amount of attention as the characters themselves, you would have ended up with something that worked a lot better. And that's sort of what I mean when I say that nothing less than perfect works for these games. I don't necessarily mean that everything has to be 100% human. It doesn't necessarily need to feel like I'm looking at this woman going through the emotional torment of having lost a child. Though certainly if you're going to deal with something that heavy, you want to make sure that the emotional beats are on point. In this case, they just sort of relied on motion capture on the actors' faces to do that sort of thing. And they missed it in a lot of places. More extreme emotions especially are harder to get because the constraints on sort of a morph on a head model are slightly different because you're bending polygons. You're not moving face muscles underneath something that's actually a fairly pliable sort of skin stretched over an actual person. What I mean when I say that these things need to be perfect, they need to be perfect as far as world realization goes. Until Dawn is a great example of this. It's very, very rare in Until Dawn that you find a camera angle showing the seams of the world. I think probably one of the worst offenders would be some of the pictures that you come across. And they just seem a little bit weird and a little bit wonky and not quite right. But that's really the worst offender in Until Dawn. They basically had their fixed camera angles and even sort of a slightly moving camera angle, but they made sure to put it in places and make sure that the textures in those places were up to snuff in a way that they didn't have to worry about it. I can't remember exactly how well Beyond Two Souls pulled this off, but in Heavy Rain, they failed on it in a lot of places, and that's one of those things that pulls you out of the texture of the world. Until Dawn did a very, very good job of making sure that you stayed in that world for a very, very long time. They gave you options that would allow you to sort of de-immerse if you wanted to, like putting the text of pictures that you pick up on the side and things like that. But by and large, it did a fantastic job. But the thing to sort of take away here, well, it's more about style. A more recent example of fidelity issues that pull you out of the experience would be Life is Strange. I mentioned in my review of that game that for the most part, the stylizing let a lot of the lower quality props slide. It was okay, but then you get to places like the junkyard, where they were lazily put together, or things like the hand texturing in that final chapter. They become so jarringly different in a bad way that the stylization can't cover up for them anymore, and then they pull you out of the game and you notice them. What's worth mentioning, just to sort of prove out the point, is that Telltale, so hard to say properly the first try, their newer games are they're consistently awful at animating characters almost entirely. Everything is blocky, everything is cartoony, but they understand that, and that's where they actually break immersion less than a game like Heavy Rain does. They're not trying to be realistic, so it's okay that everybody does that sort of show their teeth, pull their head back, and look down animation in every single game. It's okay that when they pick up a cup, it looks like shit, because everything looks that way. The style is consistent. The animation style is the same across characters. The faces aren't particularly well animated, so if all of a sudden he was picking up a cup with perfect hand placement, you'd honestly think it was a little bit weird. So Telltale, for all their faults in the games that they put together, are roaringly consistent across how the look and feel of the game works. Nothing ever really pulls you out, whereas in this game it's trying to be desperately real, so anytime an animation isn't nailed, it's really wonky to you. Until Dawn had that same issue. Every now and again you'd get an animation. The one that I can think of really explicitly was Mike talking to Matt and Emily when he first meets them in the game, and then he does this little and then we can put it together, and he does that whole thing. It's almost too motion captured looking. Part of that is because of the depth of field effect that seems to start immediately behind him, but it takes you out. It just pulls you out of the game just that little bit. So while Heavy Rain was certainly a powerful graphical showcase for the PlayStation 3, especially considering when it came out on the PS3, it is one of those games that fails on the consistency front. So you find yourself constantly being pulled out of the game when they swing around and the texture on a pizza is super flat, whereas the rest of the game looks generally pretty good. When they zoom in on a poster and the poster's pixelated, or they let you look out of a window and everything on the window is just really grainy and kind of terrible looking, but not in an intentional kind of way. Those are the sort of things that you run into that'll pull you out of a game like that. So you really have to worry about consistency when you're talking about a game like this. Graphically, it's just not consistent. And so there are a lot of things that really make you look at them, and for all the wrong reasons. I'm immersed in the environment for a minute, and then bam, there's a weird bunch of donut boxes in a crappy little room. So clearly it's one of the earlier games of this type, so some of these things can be forgiven, and I'll probably say that a couple more times before this review is done. But that's sort of my takeaway on the graphics. As the genre evolves, people do need to understand and move forward with the idea that visual consistency is absolutely paramount in this genre. It's one of those things that certainly the guys that don't nod could be knocked for legitimately. I feel like in the case of Heavy Rain, it was an early enough example of the form post, say, Fahrenheit, which was also a David Cage game. Honestly, I feel like they should have been better at it. But, given the constraints of the PS3, I would like to have seen things done a little bit more evenly rather than the focus on faces. But they didn't do that. And for that, I knocked the graphics. Not a bad-looking game for a PS3 game, but you know what? There are plenty of other games that look better in the overall because they don't try so heavily to front-load power into facial expressions and character representations on screen. They give it an even feel all the way across things. So, yeah. Apparently a child was just murdered outside. I don't know if that got through on the mic, but he's dead now, so it's fine. We can move on to gameplay. I'm going to do the short bits first here. Just the quick little complaints about gameplay before we get into the wider things that I feel like are sort of a bigger issue. Movement is an absolute royal fucking pain in the ass. It's tank controls, basically. You hold a button to move around and another button to turn around. Tank controls were an adventure game standard for a very, very long time. They were in Resident Evil. They are shit. Nobody uses them anymore. Until Dawn got away from it. And again, this is sort of the easiest game to sort of cross-compare because they very much are of the same ilk. Walk around in a room, look for things, press the button when you get to it. That's the sort of game that Until Dawn is. It does it fantastically. Again, 5 years of difference, especially in advancement in the genre since then, so we would expect Until Dawn to get a lot more right here. But tank controls, I think even at that point, were basically dead. We were in the PS3. This isn't a PS2 game. We knew how to handle analog stick movement. It's really unnecessary here. It makes getting around the rooms, and as well, the movable areas of the room, like sort of where the blocking planes are in the room, can be very, very annoying sometimes because your character doesn't... You're never quite sure with the combination of really non-specific tank controls and the fact that there are just random like sort of chunks you can't walk through that you're not necessarily sure you can't walk through. You don't necessarily ever know when you're running into something if you've gotten yourself too close to a corner or if, the tank controls are just lagging to get started up. So you'll find yourself kind of frustratedly sitting there going, okay, what do I do? Most of the motion control segments as well are too long or they fail gracelessly. I'll probably talk about that a little bit more as we go on. One of the big gameplay problems for me consistently throughout the entire course of the game, this wasn't just a one-time kind of situation that sort of stuck in my brain, this was a consistent problem throughout the entire game, was that visual cues were ruined by this sort of weird need on the part of Quantic Dream to integrate the UI into the emotional state of the character. That is to say, if your character is upset, so is whatever it is you're trying to do. It wiggles around with sort of increasing urgency. The problem with this is they've also decided to use the UI to represent what sort of action you need to do to clear this sequence. This is exacerbated by the fact that they integrate the moves into a single action. So as an example, sometimes you'll need to hold a button and then shake the controller. Sometimes you'll need to hold two buttons and then fling the controller in one direction. Not actually throw it, but you know what I mean. Sometimes you'll need to hold a button or hold two buttons and mash another button. Sometimes you'll need to hold a couple buttons and push a direction. These things all have to happen all at once or it resets the action. It is fairly frustrating. as well, but it can be very hard to tell at first blush which exactly it is that you're supposed to do. Am I supposed to mash a button, or was I supposed to just hold the button or press the button? Those are all valid things that you're supposed to do. And when the on-screen indicator of the button is shaking around, it's very, very hard to tell which one it is. I do believe on mash buttons, they put it a little bit lower in the call box than they do if it's a hold button, which generally appears center mass of the little on-screen call-out UI, but it's still very nearly impossible to quickly, if you're in that sort of situation, tell which one you need to do, which often results in you restarting whatever mundane thing it was time to do. You know, if you were supposed to hold a button to help somebody sit up and then mash it on the third thing, you're just going to lean them back down. You're going to get annoyed. It's going to take longer than it needs to, and you're going to be a little frustrated. This is going to happen to you multiple times. What are you going to do? Beyond that very specific gripe, I got to say that the gameplay at large, such as it is in this game anyway, is largely a failure of the form. It is one of the earlier examples of a sort of interactive drama. David Cage was propping it up as the first, but that's not entirely true. One of the first would probably be Fahrenheit. Honestly, there are probably some other games like that existed before. I know Omicron had some sort of sequences kind of like that where you were supposed to do things. Again, another David Cage game. And I'm sure somebody could tell me about some more QuickTime event-driven games. Certainly there were PS2 games that had large amounts of QuickTime events in them. But we're talking about a sort of interactive narrative type game. In the sort of Telltale Games sense and in the Fahrenheit sense in the Until Dawn kind of way. So we'll give him credit for this being one of the early forms of the game, except for another game that he did, which was more, it was QuickTime events, but with just button, like more rhythm-y kind of a weird thing. There's a sex rhythm game, for example, in Fahrenheit, which is pretty all right. It's all right. Again, it's a failure of the form, but let me say that I don't necessarily think that the baseline ideas of the gameplay are bad. Certainly, they're actually a large part of how we understand these games to work currently. And again, it was one of the earliest ones. I'm sure Telltale was messing around with this sort of stuff in a Jurassic Park was a while back, and it's a very similar sort of execution. There's nothing inherently wrong with the baseline idea of the gameplay. Again, look at Until Dawn, look at any number of other games, but it's more of a ham-fisted implementation than it is a series of bad ideas outright. Firstly, by way of explaining that, you're given way too specific control of the mundane, since these are slower actions that sort of make sense to an extent, while action sequences end up largely abridged down to rapid button taps. Now, that kind of makes sense, right, from a logical point of view, and I'm sure that that's why it ended up being implemented in that way. But what you end up with there is this really sort of soul-crushingly frustrating, oh my god, it takes me 45 seconds to watch this guy do something like shave his face, and they're forcing me to be engaged in face shaving, where when I'm being chased by the police or something, it's 5 or 6 button taps and I'm out of there. It's really, really fast. This is just a supreme letdown of what you're sort of supposed to be getting out of it. It goes back to that sort of almost storytelling side of things, where you go, if this isn't the most interesting thing I'm doing in a day, why am I doing it? And the game, the bulk of the time you spend in the game is spent doing these sort of mundane things, tasks that even should be exciting, crawling through a tunnel full of glass, making your way through an electrified fence of murder, death. These end up being largely mundane because they're dragged out so desperately by you having to hold basically 5 buttons down at a time to move through each segment of the electrified fence area. It's not fun. It's not an exciting thing to do, and that's why a lot of games have streamlined away from it. Even Beyond Two Souls moved away from it, which is basically, if nothing else, an admission that they failed it pretty drastically. I'm not sure if that's based on customer feedback, because I got to say the Ethan showering scene combined with walking around going, Jason, are largely considered some of the most hilarious points in the game, and really they are. They're fairly pathetic as gameplay segments, and you guys can go look at them in my videos if you want. But you spend too much time in the mundane, and some of the more exciting things that really should kind of hit you with a challenge end up being largely mundane themselves, just because of the way that they've been implemented. Fail states being non-existent, as I mentioned, means the restart of a sequence. Newer games know well enough to sort of keep pushing you through these segments and then rolling the outcome of that segment into either immediate story consequence or delayed story consequence in the sort of situation of things like Until Dawn. This feels good as a gameplay mechanic, and it gives you a reason to take part. Heavy Rain, on the other hand, basically from the beginning of the game, it feels like it's dragging me through a story and making me jump through little gameplay hoops to get where they want me to go. I have to shave my face. I don't have to shave my face. There are parts that you can skip over, little chunks, but then you end up in a situation like Ethan in the train station. He's standing around, and he's just having a little flip out. And if you don't press anything, the game never punishes you or advances the game. But once you try to start the thing, now you're on a timer. So if you don't complete the series of specific motion controller jerks in the right order, you don't fail, which David Cage says a fail state is a failure of the game designer. I'm going to disagree there, because honestly, I'd rather get a game over, but I can agree with him to an extent. He just implemented it poorly. That's what I'm saying. It's not so much that he's wrong, just that he implemented it in a ham-fisted way. So again, I start up a sequence in this train station, and rather than actually fail out of the game and be punished for it, which would take some of my time, which is a legitimate punishment, I simply have the controller flash red, and then Ethan wiggles his stupid body in a dramatic way back to the beginning of the controller sequence, and I'm forced to start it over. Literally, there's no amount of time you can wait that this results in a failure state. So that becomes annoying. At that point, I have no agency as a player, and that's one of the key things that David Cage seems to have missed about games in general, especially one predicated so heavily on choice. I don't want to shake the controller, David Cage. I want to fail this section because it annoys me. Can I do that? Absolutely not. Why would I be allowed to do that? That's ridiculous. So I'm forced to shake the controller, which means I'm not playing the game. I'm being dragged through it by an angry game designer who said, well, this is what you have to do because this is what happened to Ethan. And it ends up, like I said, just sort of being a frustrating takeaway where I am jumping through the hoops of the game rather than doing what it is that I want to do. And the problem is that seems to be so entirely consistent throughout the entire game. It's a bit more of a story side of thing, and I think I maybe mentioned it down there, but let me say it here just in case I don't once I get to the story section. You are given control over bullshit decisions and not given control over sort of more important decisions. It's a little bit weird. That is actually, it's the next thing I say. My little thing. It's more a story side of thing, but the game fails to understand when a choice is crucial. We're often allowed to make pointless conversation choices. As a for instance, just from a gameplay perspective, at some point Scott's talking to Lauren in his office about whether she's going to join the group or not. And so we're allowed to literally just click through a series of button presses that tell us, he has a little conversation with her. And then once you've exhausted your button presses, he tells her that she's joining the group. And I understand that it might be necessary for the story for her to move along, but an intelligently designed gameplay aspect of a narratively driven game would make it feel like that's my choice and not theirs. And again, in a lot of ways, this is really quite bad because it ends up making me feel, like I said, like I'm being handheld through or dragged through the game rather than that I'm making my decisions. Another instance of this that was really, really frustrating that would have been done better in other games is towards the end of the game, there is clearly a large padlock on a grate. Ethan's standing in front of it. And in any other game, you'd be given the choice to look at the padlock or to shake the grate or to try any number of other things. The padlock is insanely obvious. But Ethan is grabbing the grate because that is what the story called for some reason. It called for him to shake the grate. We are forced, no amount of waiting will stop it. We are forced to shake the grate. And once we shake the grate, once we shake our controller, thus shaking the grate, then Ethan immediately notices the padlock. So let me break that down from a gameplay perspective for you. We're holding on to a grate. We have no choice to stop holding on to the grate because we've noticed the padlock. We have to shake the grate. And then he notices the padlock on his own. You've basically put a gigantic magic mushroom in front of us, and you're telling us that Mario has to get hit by the Goomba first so that he can die and then come back and learn that, oh, the magic mushroom is good. And this is the end of the game. By this point, we should understand those sorts of things. He's basically taken the entire joy of noticing the padlock and not freaking out away from anybody that might be able to do it. It's one of those situations where if we had had the choice to just check the grate or check the padlock, some people might have said, I'm going to check that grate first just to see if that gives me any information about the grate. But in this case, what we end up doing is we're forced to shake the grate. Then he notices the padlock, and the player doesn't get a chance to go, well, I noticed the padlock, so I checked it first because I knew that's what I was going to have to do. They get no opportunity to feel smarter than another player. And another player might say, I know I'm going to need to do something with that padlock, but I'm going to check this grate first just in case. And that's going to be satisfying for them because it's completionist. They know the right way forward because you've shown it to them, but you've allowed them to go off and play with the world as it exists around them. And that's one of those things that is core to this genre, and Heavy Rain misses the boat on multiple times throughout the game. I'm sure I could find about a dozen other versions of this throughout the game in general, but whatever. The biggest gripe for me, I think, as well, was that basically until you're in the very, very last leg of the game, seriously, the last not even that long, you have free reign to pick whatever you want, as there is nearly no consequence for anything. One of the things that the game likes to try to impress on you is, and was really heavily featured in a lot of the interviews with David Cage in the lead up to the release of the game, is that there is no fail state. Characters can die and you can keep on going. There are a couple of places, largely towards the end of the game, where that happens, but really the ones that actually affect the real sort of outcome of the game as far as the characters that you are actively participating in the story of don't come into play at all. I actively refuse to take part in literally all of Scott's little Are You the Best Father thriller movie minigames, and I was in no way punished for it. The kid didn't die with me holding in his arm. Everybody survived. The only person I didn't get the best ending for was Nam and Jaden. And I literally refused to take part in large chunks of the game, just leaving and skipping action sequences and doing any number of other things. And for Jaden, the only reason I didn't get the best ending in the game was because I took the Tripto a couple of times, and I think that gave me he has a slight freak out at the end of the game kind of a thing. But he lived. Everybody else lived because I did the sort of button presses in the last chapter of the game that made sure everybody got there. And yeah, there was no real consequence. That's a real problem of narratively driven games. And honestly, considering there were 18 endings, that's how it's advertised to this game, I thought that we might end up in a better place for it, but we don't. It's the same sort of game. There are some legit middle story scene changes, and this game's probably done that the best of everything, where a gameplay decision actually means that you see an entirely different sequence. You can play through the game and not see full areas of the game, which is great. I like that. I like building a room and then not using it. That's the sort of commitment to story that needs to be in there. But in this case, it ends up falling a little bit flat because, again, you kind of find out towards the end that there's not a whole lot you can do about it. Pretty much everybody can still have their stuff taken care of as long as you just kind of play it in not a stupid way. And again, it's okay. It's not the worst game in the world from a gameplay perspective, but strictly from a gameplay perspective, it's not the worst game in the world. Of course, it's not the worst game in the world. It's a fairly high budget game, right? But It is incredibly frustrating at times, and largely there's no consequence to the choices you make. In fact, the entire thing, um, with the trials that Ethan's given throughout the game, it's completely pointless from a gameplay perspective. So that's it for gameplay. We'll move on, I'd say now, to story. The story behind the game is a series of cliches and borderline stolen scenes from other movies. At the very least, they are theft of premise. This is also true of Beyond Two Souls, so this is clearly a David Cage sort of thing, but I'll likely review that at some point, so I'm not going to talk too much about Beyond Two Souls, but you basically have the butler ripped off directly from The Shining, the sort of, user interface movement and glove kind of thing from, what do you call it? It's not AI, it's Minority Report. And again, just dozens of other scenes lifted directly from other films throughout the course of the entire story. It's really kind of a bit much. I mean, cliches are fine, but the scenes that are basically lifted from other things is really slightly frustrating. Honestly, I wish they weren't in there because I find them more of a distraction than anything else. But that's okay. We'll move on. The voice acting is atrocious. It is absolutely ridiculous for a game of this budget scale and narrative intent. It cannot afford to have that sort of terrible voice acting. Scenes end up coming off as bordering on The Room levels of comedy because there are thick European accents absolutely everywhere, and for some reason they're all being played like they're straight Boston or general American accents. It's weird to see. These people have clearly European accents. It says Boston on screen, so we know that it's set in Boston. And I don't know. Like, I don't know who let this slide by. I understand that David Cage is a French guy, but you just can't do that. You know what I mean? You can't have everybody walking around in America with European accents. It's distracting at the very least. Again, this is about immersion and sort of narrative drive, right? You can't have somebody that doesn't speak English properly throwing stuff in there. What's worse, too, is that this seems to roll into the dialogue as well. I'm not sure if David Cage had anybody go through his script and sort of properly Americanize the phrases that he uses throughout the thing, but it's obviously a script, not all the time, but in very specific spots, it's obviously a script that's written by a person for whom English is a second language. There are plenty of just weird turns of phrase, and the biggest problem seems to be that the voice actors who even were American were forced to sort of put these phrases out there in a perfectly straight English, American accent as though there were no problem. And it's weird. They're just there's those weird sort of verb in the wrong place kind of problems throughout the game. Again, this is all about a game that's trying to have you invested in the storyline, characters, and emotions of the people playing the game. And when you have somebody who legitimately delivers a line like "It's time for your snack," you can't rectify that with sort of an emotional seriousness that's supposed to be going through the game. Perhaps if you put it in French or another language that you don't understand, it comes off a lot better. But that seems like a weird way to try to cover up a game that's very heavily marketed to an American audience. And I don't know. It's one of those things that it's easily rectified. This seems to be David Cage's own masturbatory love of Europe or France, and his game suffered very, very heavily for it. It's weird for a guy that seems, for all rights and purposes, though, to want to be Luc Besson, as near as I can tell, to be sort of stuck on things this way. It's very strange to me that he didn't say, I want to get some top quality American voice actors and put them in here. Certainly that's what he did with Beyond Two Souls, and that's probably largely based on the renown of Heavy Rain as a narrative experiment. The story itself, on its face, is a very, very standard murder mystery that tries to weirdly weave in some unnecessary sci-fi with the FBI agent and his glasses. It seems like they just thought there wasn't anything quite gamey enough in the entire thing, so he puts on his magic glasses and um, walks around doing stuff with his hand so he can find things on the ground. It's a weird sort of, okay, we needed a detective, but we couldn't figure out how to make an interface that was fun for gameplay that was based on being a detective. And I don't know, like he's able to instantly scan DNA, so they really shoved a lot of the procedure of being a detective out of the way in the interest of story expedience. It just doesn't really fit in with the rest of the game at large. I mean, it doesn't make sense that this one guy has magic glasses and nobody else does, to the extent that it was proposed to me that maybe the glasses weren't even real and that there was some sort of magic brain creation of his. This isn't the case based on what I've read after the fact, but certainly it was enough to make some people think that. Um, Beyond the weird FBI sci-fi stuff, it's kind of a hard game to criticize to an extent because it's very, very bland. Nothing really particularly happens. The characters aren't large. In fact, they're all mundane. They're poorly drawn as well. Um, and that ends up being very much sort of to the detriment. It's hard to care about anyone because there's a lack of personality almost entirely running throughout the game. Everybody's kind of generic and small in personality for a game with very, very big ideas, especially the killer. Scott's desperately boring, and Madison, who's supposed to be sort of a hard-hitting reporter, comes off as basically the most interesting person in the game, but even she's kind of got sort of a shallow well of personality to dip into there. It largely just runs into her kind of wanting to fuck Ethan and otherwise being kind of generic. Whatever. The story, not the story, well, yeah, the story. The game and story are intentionally vague for what ends up being far too long in order to protect the secret of who the killer is. Basically, they hide the name as long as they can manage, to the point where they literally whisper it into a character's ear about 15 minutes before the reveal for no reason. They know that there's a character that I'm playing, and I should know what a character I'm playing is. Player agency, David Cage. Write it down on a piece of paper so you don't forget it. They tell a character I know, and then they don't show me who the actual killer is for another couple of minutes, and they do that by way of a flashback, which seems like a really stupid way to reveal the entire thing. Honestly, a little bit frustrating. Honestly, considering the kid ended up being adopted, his first name isn't even necessarily something that he would keep. Sometimes they change the first name of kids when they're adopted. That's just how it works. I think maybe the most annoying thing from a story point of view and in this same sort of vagueness end is the constant use of just utterly pointless red herrings. A lot of mystery movies, when you watch them, they take two directions. We either know everything that the character knows, or we have more information than the character. Almost never is a mystery thriller sort of pointed in the direction of the person watching the film so that characters know things that they don't. Sometimes the killer will know a thing that none of the other characters know, and thusly we don't know, and that can be fine because we're not supposed to know that. That's okay. In this case, they are purely viewer-directed events that are meant to intentionally mislead the viewer as to who the killer is or might be. And almost every single case of this is never, ever brought up again. One-off happenings that will make you go, oh, is that the guy who did it? It's ridiculous. It gets to the point, well, let me run through a couple of them. First of all, they have Ethan just wake up in the middle of the road in the middle of the road near where the accident happened, holding a dog origami figure. The guy's name's the Origami Killer, so you kind of go, oh, maybe it's Ethan. He's having blackouts and his alternate personality is running around killing people. This happens twice in the game after he blacks out. It's never explained why or how. The closest I could get to a story possible explanation would be that in some way Scott was drugging Ethan and then taking him there because he was planning to kidnap his kid so that he could use him in his little serial killer game. The ridiculous part of this is that the blackouts were happening before any of this started to go on, and that Scott would have no way of knowing when he was going to have a natural blackout. The drugging thing is from a story point of view, completely impossible because he blacks out in a park, not being shown having drunk or eaten anything, and certainly I didn't see any darts fly into his neck. So that sort of thing happens. We have the entire sequence with Ethan and the psychiatrist. We have the sequence where his wife comes to the police station for her extra 6 seconds of appearing in the game to say that he talked about drowning after he blacked out and disappeared in the middle of the night one time. They really try to throw it in that direction and really direct you towards Ethan. And at one point, there is a character who is completely unrelated. He's not a playable character. He outright confesses to being the origami killer. And weirdly, we also find out that he's responsible of having killed a child by holding his head underwater. So really, it was basically a true confession. He wasn't the origami killer, but he was certainly responsible for the murder of a child. It's weird. It's just a weird thing. It doesn't make sense. It's completely unnecessary. And the entire point of it is so that we can take a look at Scott, who is the killer, doing things that seem to be showing him going after the killer. Now, the weird part of this whole thing is that his entire interaction with this group of people, I don't know if he was looking for somebody to frame up for the job or whatever, but he has an interaction with a rich family, and that seems to be largely based off of a misdirection from Lauren. He kind of seems to maybe not want her to know. However, he has a full interaction with the father of the guy who confessed to a killing, who's very rich and threatened him a couple of times, which seems to have nothing to do with anything. He goes in there to say, your son did it, didn't he? You threw me into a lake. You know, he wasn't really mad about the lake thing. So it was a completely unnecessary bit of theater where he's trying to get him to confess that his kid was the origami killer, but there's nobody there that gives a shit. The only reason he'd try to do this is for grandstanding, or possibly so that he couldn't, you know, be tied to being the killer later on, because he was investigating it the whole time. But it's weird. You know what I mean? He doesn't need to do that for anybody. He doesn't need to show up there and threaten the guy. He doesn't kill the guy. He can let the guy die. But it's like I said, it's a very strange sequence. And there are a lot of things that Scott does that don't necessarily make sense. It's pretty much the same for Madison as well. She goes to lengths that she doesn't necessarily need to go to try to tie all these things together. And, you know, more or less ends up kind of in situations, weirdly, a lot of vaguely rapey situations, which is strange because of something I'll get into later. For no real reason. They say she's a journalist, so she's kind of trying to figure out who the origami killer is, but she kind of started this whole thing because she thought it was Ethan. I guess she decides it's not, so she continues to follow the trail now to prove that he's innocent. So hers is decently explainable, but there are a lot of things that, again, they're there strictly for the viewer's benefit, to try to make them think that the guy that is the killer isn't the killer, for reasons that just are completely unnecessary. Like, it's okay if we know who the killer is, because if we're playing the killer, we can always try to side with the killer and have him get away with it. But all we really ever need to know is exactly what the characters know. That's a decent enough rule. If you have a point of view character, a character that you're following, primarily the audience should basically know everything that character knows. That's called your narrative proxy, and you want your narrative proxy to be someone that you can rely on. You know, there's obviously the unreliable narrator situation, which is used in a lot of different cases to very good effect in fiction, including Fight Club, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, a number of other great books. So yeah, unreliable narrators, great Confederacy of Dunces as well, things like that. Unreliable narrator is a great thing when it's used to good effect. In this case, that's not what we see. We just see standard narrator, but having the player, who's supposed to have agency, who's supposed to be living through these characters, not have the information that the characters that the player is playing has, which is a bad move, I'd say. Aside from the red herrings, there are myriad other unexplained or unaddressed things. Just from a story point of view, Ethan goes from rich to dead poor, living in literally a fancy constructed house in a nice place with a large backyard in a suburban neighborhood, to dead poor in an inner city house where he drives a shitty car. And then at the end of the game, He's back. If you got a good ending, he doesn't hang himself in a jail cell, and he's back living in a very, very nice apartment that apparently somebody helped him skip in line on. So it really, it's not well explained. Like, why did he end up poor? Did he just stop being a reliable architect? If so, why does the fact that he managed to clear his son's name turn things around for him so quickly? Very frustrating there. This all seems to be based on his emotional state, so I guess his house is just a reflection of his internal state. Jaden has a substance abuse addiction that's possibly related to his glasses. At least that's what a wiki article I read after I finished the game said. It's never explained or talked about, except where this butler, who's an utter ripoff from The Shining, comes in and says, "You shouldn't do you know what, sir," and taps his nose and does that whole fucking deal. But again, they never talk about it. They never explain what he's addicted to, what Tripto is, why he's taking it, what are the effects that these glasses have on his psyche. They don't seem to be attached to his brain in any way. They just seem to be glasses that he can put on and, play little alternative reality games with. And that really exposes what this entire, sub-story is based on. The entire sort of addiction subplot is based on the fact that that's David Cage making a statement about a human's reliance on alternate reality as an escape from the world in which he lives. And it's a ridiculous statement. It has nothing to do with the game at large. It's just something that he's decided to shoehorn in so we know how he feels about virtual reality, and then we can move along. But it ties into Jaden's story fairly deeply for reasons that, again, are never explained, never dealt with, and really never made to be something that we're supposed to care about. The focus of the game seems to be so incredibly strongly on this main plot that David Cage doesn't seem to know that you have to give equal measure to a subplot if it's something that emotionally involves a point of view character. A subplot for a point of view character is basically a second plot. They're all in the main plot, but obviously Jaden's emotional, needs are going to be related to what he's dealing with in his real life. They very shallowly try to deal with that. Madison as a character is basically set up with this really completely unexplained rape dream that she has in her apartment. It is never explained at all. I have no idea if that changes based on the dialogue options that you pick, but we get this massive opening sequence where men in balaclavas come into Madison's apartment, throw her around, and again, she ends up in a lot of rapey situations, and that's just the start of them. She is introduced as a character who's basically threatened with either murder or rape. They end up cutting her throat, but she's in her underwear the entire time. So certainly there's a visual metaphor for, sexual vulnerability there, and that seems to largely be the entire thing around which her character revolves. She has a single conversation with Ethan that sort of trends that way. As I was playing the game, it didn't make itself incredibly obvious to me. I sort of poked in that direction. She said she didn't want to talk about it, and that's it. That's all we get of Madison's backstory. We know that she's a journalist, and because we happened to witness one of her dreams, we know that I guess she's scared of men breaking in and cutting her throat or raping her or something. It's really hard to tell. But again, it's shown and then never addressed again. The character isn't fleshed out in a meaningful way, and that's part of the problem. Scott is another one of those problems. He seems to be very, very rich for somebody who lives in a terrible apartment and spends the bulk of his time murdering children. He does own, these are things that are just hard to explain. He owns waterfront property. He throws $100 bills around to try to get information out of people. He's very quick to pay for things and do things that he needs to do. While he investigates himself as the killer. It's sort of a weird thing that he's investigating himself as the killer. Part of that's, it seems to be suggested that it's to recover evidence that he sent out to people, and that's his entire deal. But this is a guy who used to be a cop. That's all we're ever told he used to be, and now he's a private investigator. But still, he throws money around readily. We have no idea where he's getting it from, and he lives in a terrible part of town, sure, but he still has a secret orchid growing room in the back, and all of his appliances are fairly nice, and the place is pretty up to date. It's weird, it's inconsistent, and it's never explained. It's one of the things that I asked very early on in the game. Who's paying for him to investigate these murders? Because he seems to be talking to parents of children who disappeared, but we never see him talk to the person who's supposed to be paying him. Obviously, the payoff to this sort of thing, if you run it out, is that it's him. He's doing it to try to cover his own tracks, but we don't talk about where he gets the money then. If somebody's hiring him, we know he's going to be able to expense it. And so it's fine that he's throwing $100 at random prostitutes to try to get information out of her. As it is, he's just, I guess, rich for some reason. Not really clear. Maybe there was a payoff. Maybe I missed a line of dialogue about a payoff from the rich people, but he was adopted. So that payoff would have gone to the parents of the kid who drowned. It would have gone to him. He wouldn't have had that money. And even then, if he did have that money, that would imply that there was at least a sort of amount of information given where the guy who owned the construction lot where his brother drowned, which is why he's a serial killer in the first place, would have been the one to pay over the money, which means he would have known that the kid that he paid the money to was Scott Shelby, which is the guy that's beating the shit out of him in his office. So again, he would have been able to put all this stuff together, but it doesn't happen. So it's a little bit frustrating. The game's subplots to that end are often truncated for no reason as well. I mean, not just the one about Jaden and his substance abuse, and it seems to have been done for no other reason than David Cage seems to be uncomfortable writing people actually having a fucking conversation with each other. Most of the talking that goes on with any other human being in the game is fairly short and awkward. None of the conversations really last more than a couple of lines in general, and most of the time those conversations are, I don't know, they seem like a caricature of the movies that David Cage has seen. There's maybe supposed to be subtext to the subplots, but they all end up more or less falling flat and feeling rushed because they get pushed aside by lack of options to pursue them in some cases, and in other cases it's by a lack of actual conversation when they are pursued. As a, for instance, with Ethan, he wants to get with Madison, I guess, and Madison wants to get with him. So there's basically two short conversations that they have where she comes to his room because he's wounded. There are a couple other ones, just really tiny ones here and there. And then apparently they're in love. That was enough for it to happen. And there's really no chance to talk about that. You can sort of be honest and or be rude or be whatever. But I actually sent her away at one point. I was like, get out of here. I don't need your sexy loving. And she left, but we still had our romantic subplot come back in. And she still followed me around. And I mean, it was weird. It was like, in case she's writing a story about him, but is she obsessed with him? Based on the play choices I made, she shouldn't have liked me. But she still did anyway, so it was like, whatever. And you can actually choose. They give you a binary option to not make out with her. And I guess that's it. That's when that's determined. It's not a built up sort of thing. It's just a binary kiss her or don't because she's persistent about trying to bone you. And then you wake up, you don't discuss your relationship or where it's going or what's happening or anything like that. There's just sort of, I guess, a million unspoken things that we're supposed to assume. It's the same with Scott and Lauren, which is weird because he looks like he's well into his 50s, honestly, based on the actor that they got to play him, or at least the facial model that ended up coming out of that actor. I don't know if it's just because he's a tall, fat guy or what. Basically, there's a point in the game, Lauren comes in and she's sort of forced to be his sidekick, and then she gets out of the car and goes and stands in the street, which is another thing that I'm not entirely sure you're even allowed to skip one way or another. Scott gets out of the car, walks over. You have an option to caress. I chose caress. I don't know if it ends up the same way either way. He touches her face, and I guess that's supposed to be shorthand for them being somehow in love with each other. What, because he's been nice to her for a day and a half? He hasn't even been nice to her based on my playthrough. He's been kind of curt and said, okay, you can come along if you have to. And then I guess they get thrown into a river and some stuff happens, but for whatever reason, there's literally no non-work related shit said to each other pretty much at any point throughout this entire game. He gets information from her. She wants to join the team. She joins the team. End of story. They don't have a meaningful conversation where they get to know each other and then they fall in love, and then there's just nothing said. And then he kisses her goodbye at a train station a couple scenes later, and you're just kind of sat there going, when the fuck did this happen? I didn't get the memo about the old fat man being in love with the young prostitute whose kid's dead. What? Doesn't make any sense. It just comes out of nowhere. Again, the subplots just get dropped left and right. A lot of the stuff with Nathan, basically, the guy's partner, they have sort of an animosity. It comes to a head where you get in a fight in an interrogation room, and then that's it. That's it. Nathan just basically disappears from that point on, except for a couple little corollary scenes, and then he shows up at the ending to continue to be a dickhead to everybody. There's no real development of their thing. They never really come to grips with each other. There's no epilogue sequence where it shows him respecting Nam and Jaden for, sorry, I have to say it like that, for having resolved the entire case and having been right about things in the first place. There's never an apology given. Nothing like that. There's no wrap up to subplots in a lot of cases either. The ex-wife and mother was probably the most upsetting one, because she's now bordered on losing 2 children, but apparently since David Cage is such a fucking narcissist, he only seems to care what the father thinks about it. And that's the entire thing. It's about what a father loves his children or whatever. And so the mother of the children shows up in the prologue when they're still married, and then at the police station to be upset at you for the kid being kidnapped, and then at the police station one more time for about 25 seconds to file a report with the police that you might be the killer. It's weird. She doesn't show up in the epilogue. She doesn't show up at any other point in the game, and this is a person who they have split custody with. It's explicitly stated, your mother has you next week, when he's feeding his kid a shitty microwaved pizza. There should be more of her in the game. It doesn't make sense that she's never around. She's not constantly calling Ethan to try to understand what's going on or to try to be a part of his life in any way, and that's because they wanted to move Madison in. The guy hasn't gotten over the death of his kid over the course of 2 years, and who knows when they got a divorce. Probably not right after the kid died. I would assume 6 months to a year after. So this is a woman that he was in love with. They split apart because of his own psychological inadequacies, and now they never talk to each other, even though they have shared custody. Doesn't make sense. It really doesn't make sense. Furthermore, the fact that they have shared custody is never really addressed as something that's weird, considering the fact that Ethan is psychologically disturbed to the point of having blackouts. That's we won't even call that a subplot. We'll just call that, David Cage not having a handle on the American sort of custody system. But whatever, she should be there, but she's not. She's gone the bulk of the time. And I'm not even saying that she'd necessarily be a character that you'd be happy to deal with, but it's a situation that should be addressed. She's there. What is she, just at home with her new boyfriend talking about how much this sucks and going, gee, I sure hope Ethan isn't the one. I mean, like, there are a million possible amazing scenes that could happen there where she just shows up and flips out on Ethan and accuses him of stuff. Obviously, at some point he leaves his house and goes to a random hotel room, but still, that they should be talking to each other at least a little bit. Doesn't happen. Nobody really talks to anybody, and that's sort of a short part of the problem with everything. There's like a weird balance between talk and gameplay where there's not a lot of gameplay, but you do as much gameplay as talking, which just means there's not a lot of talking. And for a story-driven game, it ended up being a little bit of a letdown. Nobody really gets to know anybody else. You just kind of are dragged through. Even the characters, to an extent, are dragged almost without any consideration for what feelings they might have as real human beings through a story that most of them don't necessarily seem to have a vested interest in, even though they have really dramatic speeches at turns about how much they want to save this kid. It largely just seems to be an extension of David Cage's own opinion of how this story should go. Everybody should be invested in saving the kid's life, even the serial killer, because that's the point. The serial killer wants the father to come and save the kid, and it's just weird. Like, so even he doesn't want the kid to die. I don't know. It's really just kind of a manifestation of David Cage's own weird fatherly feelings or something like that, and it comes off as sort of self-absorbed in that way because nobody's involved in the storyline except the guy who wrote and directed it. Even his characters aren't involved. I certainly wasn't. I didn't care what happened, and at points I desperately tried to make the game go wrong. I desperately tried to make the game go wrong. The story did not reward me for this in any way, neither did it punish me. And again, that's what happens. You end up walking through to the end of the game and it's bland on bland with nothing happening except, these sort of large dramatic speeches that just mirror things that he's seen in other games of sort of the same type, or at least visually similar movies, I should say, of the same type. Moving on to the conclusion of the whole thing, I think the story itself could be forgiven. Standing on its own, its biggest flaw is that it borrows heavily from a dozen films and it sits on every cliche it can manage to press down. You could say it veers into bad territory in that once you start analyzing it a little bit more deeply, it's very obviously David Cage's own love letter to himself as a father, which is a little bit disgusting, but it seems in line with pretty much every piece of wank he's put out so far. They're all just explorations of his own fetishization of things that he likes or dislikes, and in this case, he likes himself because he loves his own kids, so he wanted to tell everybody how much he likes himself because he loves his own kids in game form. I don't think that that's necessarily a recipe for a bad story, though, so I don't consider that a problem within the game. The story should stand on its own merits, just not on the back of the sort of ideology that bred it. If you read a novel that's written by someone because they are anti-war, you don't have to say, I hate this because ideologically this person is anti-war. You say, was the story good? Were the characters good? And was it well told? I could read a story about someone and I absolutely hate, and that's largely Chuck Palahniuk's entire market as an author. He writes books about sort of irredeemable people and turns them into heroes. And you can still love it. You don't have to agree with the main character in Choke to still sort of understand what's going on. And I think that one was even semi-autobiographical, if not autobiographical. But still, the takeaway is that the ideology that breeds something isn't what you judge a story based on. You judge a story based on the story. In this case, the story is mediocre at best. The characters don't seem to care what they're doing except when they're giving a large speech, and that largely depends on how you play the game. I could say that Ethan is the one exception to that rule because he's the stand-in for David Cage. But it's not awful. The graphical breaks in immersion could even be forgiven to an extent that were the story stronger and the gameplay more inviting and less ostracizing, they might not have represented so much of a distraction. That wasn't the case. Even the gameplay on its own is really just more of a bag of mistiming and a misunderstanding of the impact it might have on the story or the player experience. It's not necessarily something that in itself is bad. The gameplay mechanics aren't wrong. Certainly we could argue that the popularity of the genre moving forward is proof of that. That's something that we put in games regularly now and people love it. I think the real problem is that in the end, Heavy Rain is a victim of the sum total of its parts. Each of them is a little worse than it's allowed to be in the final product. And it ends up being weak at all the critical structural points that should have kept it standing as a game on its own. It falls down because while the higher ideas involved may have been all right, the structure they're standing on is even at its best poorly executed. And that's what you walk away with. You walk away with this sort of top-heavy, ideal-driven game that's put together by a series of missed timings and not quite good enough looking graphics with a story that just doesn't come together in a cohesive way or have characters that you're able to care about. It all falls down and there are no pieces worth picking up. So even though it should have just been a mediocre game based on the parts themselves, when you add them all together, there's enough bad in just the right places that it becomes kind of a bad game and you really don't want to play it again. I certainly don't. And that's it, man. That's what Heavy Rain was. It's what Heavy Rain is. And honestly, I'd avoid it if I were you. It's not very good, and it's not for lack of trying to make it good. It just missed the point in too many different ways, and I think the authorship of David Cage is largely to blame for that. He's put his name pretty much every place you can except the box, which to me is sort of a tacit admission that he's guilty of the structural weaknesses of this game and should be held as such. We'll see if he's improved by the time I get around to Beyond Two Souls, which I've already played, and generally it was pretty alright. But we'll see how it goes when I get there. Heavy Rain, though, not worth it. Not unless you want to be frustrated quite a lot and not paid off with anything too grand at the end. And if you've listened to this review all the way through, you pretty much already get the big reveal that David Cage seemed to think was going to blow your mind. So if you're going to play it for the enjoyment of hating yourself. See if you can get to a level of self-loathing that I did. And hey, why not record it and upload it to YouTube? Either way, that's going to be it for this review here. Heavy Rain, meh. Pretty bad, pretty frustrating. I'd avoid it. I've said that too many times now, so we'll just chalk it up. We'll wipe our hands of it, and we'll be done. And I'm going to go play some Euro Truck Simulator to calm down now that I've had to think about Heavy Rain again. So, all right, until next time, guys, please take a look around the channel, like and subscribe if you're into that sort of thing, and that's it for me. Thanks for listening.